And this is Ensign Santana with Commander Norton. And today we're here to talk about socialization. Commander, how does lessons related to our last one on culture relate to socialization, sir?
Hey Juan, it's great to be back here with you. I think first the difference between socialization and socializing is important. A lot of people hear the word socialization and they think, oh, going out with my friends or getting better people skills. That's an aspect of socialization, but socialization goes beyond that in that we're talking about our self-identity and all the things that encompass that. So values, norms, behaviors, some of the things that we talked about in our last podcast on culture, basically everything that makes us who we are. Now, there's two purposes to socialization. One is for us, right? As individuals, we don't automatically know how to operate in a given culture. We have to learn that. So by the process of socialization, we learn all the things that are appropriate to say, to do, how to act, how to dress, etc. So that's one part of it. Now, an equally important part is for the culture itself. It's the way that culture perpetuates itself over time. So without socialization, you could have a very robust built up culture with all different values and behaviors. And if there are no new individuals to learn it, the culture is going to die. So that's what socialization is, and two of the important functions that it serves.
So, how do we develop as individuals based on the socialization process, sir?
For that question, Juan, I think that it's important to cover, a few different outlooks. We have the psychological outlook. Now, Piaget has 4 stages of psychological development. Then you have Mead, who is a social psychologist, who has 3 stages. I'm not going to go in detail into those right now. They're in the reading if you want to get into them. But I do want to cover Cooley's looking glass self. Now, Cooley was a symbolic interactionist, which means he was primarily concerned with how people are, their relationship, how they're interacting throughout their day. And his concept of the looking glass self went something like this. You basically imagine how you present yourself to someone else. You then imagine what impression they're forming of you. And based on those first 2 steps, you form a real impression of yourself, some real feelings about yourself. So it's important to note the first 2 are perceptions. Your perception of how you're acting and your perception of what someone else thinks about you, but then real feelings form. So, the old saying, perception is reality, sort of applies here, except it's our perception in this case.
So, sir, do you mind giving us an example of that?
Yeah, sure, Juan. I think a good one from my life was right after graduating from the Naval Academy when I was in flight school. So I'm a helicopter pilot. I was for 16 years. And to learn how to fly, we went to the helicopter training squadron. And for me, it took me a lot longer to learn how to hover than some of my friends. And I can remember sitting in the training helicopter with my instructor and looking over, and he was scowling at me more often than not. So my impression of how I was presenting myself, or my perception, was that I haven't figured this out yet. And then I'm looking at him and he's scowling, and my perception was that he is angry at me because I haven't learned yet. So I started to doubt myself, especially when it took a couple extra flights. I was getting down on myself, thinking, why can't I do this? Well, come to find out, he had back problems. And he's scowling because he's sitting over there in the tiny little training helicopter with his back hurt. But those were real feelings for me. I remember feeling doubtful of myself for a little bit until I got it. So I think that's a great example of the looking glass self concept.
Well, sir, thank you for that example. So, is there only one way that socialization happens?
So, Juan, in general, it's the same process. I think it's helpful to look at different stages maybe of individual development or where you're at with respect to culture. So if you are looking ahead in your life and you're thinking, I want to be a part of that, whatever the culture is, say before you came to the Naval Academy and now you're trying to read on the internet or get into a chat group and find out what do I need to do. That's what we call anticipatory socialization. You're going to start to change some of your behaviors and maybe even values ahead of time before you even become a part of the new culture in preparation. Then we have what's called resocialization. That happens pretty soon after you join the new culture. And as the re prefix would say, you're trying to unlearn some old things and learn some new things. So that's the key part of resocialization, is getting rid of some old value or behavior in favor of some new value or behavior that's more compatible with the culture that you're joining. For me, an easy one, again, I'm trying to think of my midshipman days. High school, I didn't clean my room. My room was a mess. Now, clearly, that didn't go over well when I showed up on I-Day, and I quickly learned the appropriate way to clean my room and stow the gear and all that. So that's an example of resocialization of my behavior.
Well, thank you, sir. So, how does this relate to everything we've talked about so far in NL 110, such as the two system model of the mind and also perception versus bias?
Yeah, so there's many connections. Thinking back to the two system model of the mind, right? System one being the fast automatic and system two being the more slow and deliberate. A large percentage of what's going on in our minds is system one automatic. We're not even realizing it. It's happening at an unconscious level. Then following in our perception and bias lesson, we learned how some of that unconscious action that's happening in our mind can translate itself with the schema or the mental models that we learned about, and how sometimes if we're not thinking about those, it can trip us up unwittingly as we're trying to interact with others. Today, in socialization, we're seeing how we get those mental models, because by and large, we don't show up on this earth with everything set to go in our mind. A vast majority of the schema and mental models in our mind we learn from somewhere. And it's that socialization process that makes us who we are. I've got a slide here I'm going to show as an example of that. So what just came up was a picture of a Viking battle. Let's say this is somewhere in Sweden over 1,000 years ago. And after this battle, a warrior died. Now, this was a wealthy warrior because they were laid to rest in a fancy grave, many different artifacts in there, 2 sacrifice horses. So for generally the past 1,000 years, archaeologists have assumed that this Viking warrior was a man. Now, recently, with DNA analysis, if I go forward here, we've learned that this was actually a woman Viking warrior. And in fact, if you look back in Viking lore, shield maidens are mentioned many times fighting side by side with the male warriors. But because of the socialization process that archaeologists up until very recently have gone through, they had that mental model or schema of a Viking warrior being a man, and thus they just assumed that that was a man in the grave, and recently found out they were wrong. So I think that's a good example of how sometimes our mental models or our schemas can lead us astray. And again, it's just so important to remember that, you know, we learn these things from somewhere. That's the socialization connection for today.
So, sir, is there any connection between the cultural values we learned about in our last lesson and the personal values we'll talk about in the next lesson?
Yeah, certainly is one. And before I talk about values, let me backtrack and offer that, you know, the good news is, although some of those schema and mental models are unwittingly acted upon, we can apply that system 2 effort, right, and deliberately improve ourselves to make our mental models and our schema more robust. So as soon as you fill in those models with more and more detail, you're less likely to misapply them. But of course, that takes system two effort, right? Yeah, so to your values question, the agents of socialization, I think, are helpful in understanding this because in our last lesson, we learned about values as a part of culture. And that's just one aspect. Today, we're learning how an individual like me learns a new culture. So I show up at the Naval Academy, I learn certain things, and probably my values change slightly to align more with becoming a naval officer. Well, those agents of socialization, your family, your friends, school, it talks about mass media as well in the reading. I think those are the connection between the cultural values and then the individual values that we have. So I know growing up, my family, my friends, for me, my religion, they were very significant sources of value development for me. But then at the Naval Academy, different agents took over. Still friends for sure, but now probably we're into the realm of special obligations and all the different commitments we make as naval officers, like to the Constitution, raising our hand and taking an oath. So some of those different agents of socialization start to come in the workplace and continue our development. So for me, I think it's the agents of socialization, and that's how myself as an individual learns the values that guide my behavior.
Well, sir, always. Well, thank you, sir, for your time. And don't forget to tune in for our next podcast for our future lessons.